Howard Mackie, welcome to Creator in Conversation. How are you keeping today?
I am well, thank you, Owen.
It's wonderful, and thanks so much for taking the time to speak with me. This is actually going to be our season two finale when it goes out, so it's wonderful to wrap up with yourself. Now, if we don't come back for season three, the blame lies with you. So that's the that's the disclaimer.
Well, we'll see what we can do.
So I was just to check in. I think we connected. It might have been. I'm trying to get it all straight because of like COVID years and everything. I think we connected before the pandemic. I just joined on Facebook, and then everything in the world got crazy, and then
Yes.
we've been back and forth. But of course, you've also had recent health scares as well. So I just want to check in. How are you doing yourself now at the moment?
Oh,
Everything. How's it going?
the shirt I've taken to wearing to the first day of any convention I attend now is not dead. I'm not dead yet. Uh, from Monty Python and the Holy Grail. Because yes, no, I'm totally fine. I did have a recent, well, 2 years ago. 2 years ago, I almost died. Oh, come on.
But no, that's great to hear, and just to finally connect. This is our first, I think, actual conversation that wasn't written correspondence, and it's we're just talking a little before the recording, and it's wonderful to see you're like fully like disengaged, happy out with everything. And I suppose to kick us off in this conversation, let's just bring it back to the beginning. Then, what would have been the genesis of your career? Because you're a noted editor and writer, but which came first for you when breaking into Marvel? You were saying just before the recording, your prior work was more of a formal office kind of relation. How did you make that leap into comics?
Well, it was less of a leap than a stumble. I often say I tripped and fell into to it. What I had an office job where I was working for an exporting company, where we were buying and selling machinery, mining machinery for and shipping it to Australia and New Zealand. And I did that for quite some time. I started while I was still in high school and, at a very low level, and then kind of worked my way up. Never really had an affinity for it. And at that time, I grew up with a gentleman whose name may be familiar to you and maybe some of the audience by the name of Mike Carlin, who
Yep.
was the ultimately was the editor-in-chief of DC Comics for many years, responsible for oversaw the death of Superman storyline and all that. But Mike and I grew up together, and we used to this was in the late 70s and early 80s. We went to a lot of clubs together. We're very big into the new wave movement. And in the right around that time, there was an explosion of clubs in New York City, where we were both from Brooklyn, right outside of New York City. And it got to a point where Mike, who uh, his career track was always art related. He went to an art high school, and then he went to School of Visual Arts for his college education, and ultimately he got a job at Marvel Comics, first selling some little cartoony things for their humor magazine, Crazy, and then he became an assistant editor for with Mark Gruenwald. So the Avengers line of books, Avengers, Captain America, Iron Man, those books, and the official handbook of the Marvel Universe. And that was in around 1980. Well, it was 1984. He was getting a promotion from assistant editor to full editor. And he was really tired of hearing me whine about how much I didn't like my job. So he said, "Why don't you apply for the job?" It was more, the interview was more about personality than any particular skill set. But because Mike had been working at Marvel for a few years at that point, I was caught up on all the continuity of the comics, which I had drifted away from because I've read comics as a young as a kid and even into my teens, but then I really drifted away from I wasn't buying comics every week. Um, but all of a sudden I had free comics, and so I got caught up on everything. And so I interviewed for the job, and I made it as an assistant editor. And as I often joke, really the major qualification to be an assistant editor was you really need to have one working finger on your hand to push the button on the photocopy machine. Was not a lot else that was really required, but I learned on the job. And I really was not planning on staying in comics. I saw it as a transition job that would get me out of the job that I had been in for 9 years. And a number of things happened. Number one, I walked in the door, and the first day when I walked was brought into the office by Mark Gruenwald, who was the full editor. There was a young woman sitting on the couch in our office, and I found her to be quite attractive. And I thought, oh, this is going to be a really good place to work because there were no single young women at my former job. And I thought, okay, this is going to be great. Well, turned out there were not a large number of women working in comics at the time. There were a few. And she and I ultimately started dating. And I'll go pick her up from work in a couple of hours because we've been together for 42 years. So that cemented me into
Yeah.
Marvel a little bit. But then I also found that I had an affinity for it. I was talking here, get ready for name dropping. I was talking to a friend of mine a few minutes ago, John Byrne, and he and I were talking about that particular time at Marvel, the early to late 80s was a very special time. It really is hard to explain to people how much fun it really was. None of us were making a lot of money, but we really enjoyed what we were doing. And everybody was there. So and it was always, you always could count on people showing up at the office on 2 days because most people, the creative people, the writers and artists, usually lived around New York City. We didn't do any, because the whole digital world did not exist at that point. Everything had to be brought up to the office or sent in to the office. So most artists in particular lived around, in Brooklyn or in New Jersey or areas around New York City that they could afford. And you could count on them to show up 2 days. One was the day that the vouchers, the invoices were to be turned in, there was a cutoff during that. And then on payday when the checks were issued. But that meant, at the end of any given day, one of those 2 days, you'd be sitting in an office with John Byrne and Walt Simonson and Bill Sienkiewicz, John Romita Jr., and on and on and on. I mean, you name an artist from that period, and we were just sitting around, throwing around ideas, just BSing in general. And that's where some storylines came from.
Wow.
Just, oh, what if we did this? Because it was a bunch of, you know, um, basically overaged kids who all love comics and love the characters, just kicking around ideas. So that's how I got into the editorial side of it. Um, and what happened was I was an assistant editor for Mark, and we were, as I think I said, we were doing the Avengers line of books. And Iron Man at that time was being written by Denny O'Neil.
Mm.
And Denny and the editor in chief at the time had a falling out. and Denny was fired.
Hmm.
Um, he did okay.
True.
Immediately being scooped up by DC. Um, but that meant he was fired not only from his editorial uh, side of the job, but the writing side. And he was in the middle of a storyline. And the way I remember the conversation going with Mark, he and I were sitting in our office, in the office we shared, and trying to figure out where things were going to go. And Mark said, "We need to find somebody to finish up Denny's storyline." And I said, "Yes, we do." And he said, "And it needs to be somebody that knows where it was going." I said, "Yes, it does." And he said, "It's going to be you." And I said, "Oh, no, 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 no. I had no interest in pursuing writing at that time." And he said a line that I have used often with freelancers and also with my children when they were growing up. He said to me, "Oh, Howard, you're confusing what we're having right now for a conversation. You're going to write that story." Because he also felt it was very important uh, for somebody working on our side of the desk, the editorial side of the desk, to be informed about what it felt like on the other side, on the
Mm.
creative side. And the best way to do that is to create and to have to work with an editor. So that was my introduction into writing comics, which was Iron Man number 211, The Return of the Living Laser. I'm not sitting in my office right now. I'm down in the dining room, but I have the splash page to the original art hanging over my workspace, and
It's awesome.
because the artist Alex Saviak was very kind, and the day that the art was returned, he came down to my office and gave it to me, and he said to me, "Howard, this is the first time that your name is going to appear in a comic with a credit writer, and I'm sure it's not going to be the last." And I feel like that was my talisman, my good luck charm, and so it's always existed over my workspace ever since. But yeah, so I wrote Iron Man 211, and then it got published, and all of a sudden editors showed up and said, "Oh, we didn't know you could write." And I remember my first response was, "I think the jury is still out on that one, whether I can or not. I have written one story." But I just started getting more and more opportunities to write comics, and it was a really a situation where I was learning on the job,
Mm.
and I've always counted myself very, very fortunate with the people, that I was surrounded by just at the office. They were just, they had so much knowledge of the art and craft of making comics. But then the artists that I started out working with, and so much, I learned so much by working with the artists. I worked Marvel method,
Mm.
which there's a lot of I think there's a lot of misunderstanding as to what that is. I know it existed early on as one thing when Stan was working with uh, Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko. By the time I came onto staff at Marvel, it had morphed into something else. We didn't write full scripts at that time. And I don't know how knowledgeable your audience will be about this, but a comic book script now is more akin to a screenplay,
Mhm.
where you designate each panel, each page, and each panel on the page, and the writer says what happens in that panel, and then puts the dialogue beneath it. A
Mhm.
plot is much looser than that. You don't give the absolute panel one, panel two, panel three. Sometimes you even combine pages. Sometimes I would write them descriptions as scenes, and but there's a lot. There's a more collaborative nature to it. I always, and again, I write a different plot than one of my colleagues, like Tom DeFalco, would write. He
Mhm.
really is nuts and bolts. This is what happens in this scene. This is what happens in that scene. I have to put dialogue in because if I don't, I won't remember what I thought the character was thinking or going to say at that point. But
Yeah.
anyway, that was a long answer to a very simple question.
That no, no, that's all. That is all gold, my friend. That's amazing because particularly on the last bit there on dialogue, so I was just curious as well if you were to go back then after it was drawn, then to add the dialogue, but you worked the method in because it's kind of like I hate the expression like breaking out of prison. There's like once one person does it, it's sealed off, someone else finds another way. I find writing comics and entering into the comic industry, it's the same metaphors applied. Like how one person arrives, what one person's process is different, yet the magic is at the end of it all, you're left with a comic that we all identify as a comic, but how you arrive there, it's very nuanced and different. And it's not a science. It's not two plus two is four. It's here's what works best for you and how it communicates with the audience. And it's really inspiring and very interesting because I'm something of a process junkie. I love listening to people
As am
about their
I.
craft. Mm.
And
Mm.
yeah, as a result, number one, just to address your previous point, so when I would get the artwork back after
Mhm.
writing the plot, then I would do the dialogue,
Mm.
but I had my guidelines already,
Yes.
what I thought they were going to think or think or be saying. I already had that in my plot. So essentially my doing the first draft of the dialogue was more a second draft because I already
Mhm.
had the beginnings in the plot. But yeah, I am all about process, and to the point of back in the day, and still I love finding scripts or plots or whatever of other writers. I mean, back when I was on staff, I would just walk around to other editors and say, I'd find out who my favorite writer was. And like I remember Louise Simonson, I would go in and say to her editor, "Ooh, can I have a couple of plots just to see how they approached it, or Peter David, or everybody, or I was getting it on a day-to-day basis for 7 years because I was on staff at Marvel as an editorial for exactly 7 years, to the day, which Mark Gruenwald made me do. Uh, I had given him my 2 week notice, and Mark made me. And this was when um, some of the I was getting regular writing work, and I was starting a young family and not getting to spend too much time with them. So I decided to take a chance and go freelance. But I I just kept asking for everybody's plots because I wanted to read them and see. Sometimes it was something as simple as, oh, look at that. Oh, they're using a different font. Or, I like that. Maybe that will make me more creative. It was the things that we did to procrastinate before we had social media. Uh,
And it's actually on the social media front, it's kind of lovely to hear because with a lot of the speakers that we've had before in the podcast, like in season one, we had Paul Kupperberg among others, and they had similar tales of the days of going in for the vouchers and everyone would be there and hang out. And it's kind of nice and the in person. And I know we're having this conversation over Zoom. We're in different countries, different time zones, and it connects us. But then there is something kind of missing of where, the in-person connectivity and that collaboration, it's a different dimension. But it's lovely to hear that you're still in contact with so many people as well. Sometimes when I interview actors and they worked on a TV show, they would have a cast and they've been together, but when the show's over, they kind of drift, and it's just the nature of the business. But in comics, it seems you make a friend, even if the book got roles change, you still stay in contact. So that's
I,
quite nice to hear.
I'm I my my best friendships were made during that period. Unfortunately, Mark Grunwald is no longer with us. He passed away almost 30 years ago, which
Oh,
is
wow.
hard for me to imagine. But Um, I am in regular contact with quite a few,
Mm,
both, people who I worked with in editorial. Bobby Chase, who was my longtime editor on Ghostwriter.
mm,
She and I, we talk all the time, and my wife and I went and spent a weekend with her and her husband not too long ago. Bob Harris, who was the X-Men editor and then editor-in-chief of DC Comics, he's one of my best friends. We talk on a regular basis, getting together with he and Terry Kavanaugh, who is another longtime Marvel editor and writer, and we're going to Bob's house for a barbecue in a couple of weeks.
ah,
So,
lovely.
and I talked to John Byrne and Walt and Wheezy Simonson, and yes, that's why I just did a convention in North Carolina called Heroes Con, which is a wonderful, wonderful Comic Con. In that the way I always describe it is like it sometimes feels to me like a giant party or cocktail party for professionals, comic book professionals, and the fans happen to be invited to it because I can't walk down. They have quite a few comic book guests, and yeah, I can't walk down an aisle without running into somebody I've known for 40 years or more, and others that, I've worked with on multiple projects, John Romita Jr. and Lee Weeks and
Mm,
uh, all those folks. So yeah, it was a special time in
mhm.
in comics. I don't believe it exists on the same level.
Yeah.
Um,
There's pros and cons. Like I know there are many of my colleagues and contemporaries now who like I was about 19, we got into the small press here, but the good news was the internet was and social media was so much more established that now they're working for big publishers.
right.
So they have that opportunity, but the that kind of the virtual bullpen, as it were, it's not the same. Um,
No,
but
no,
you,
we were. I mean, when I broke in to comics, this was 1984. Um, I I felt like it was a very fortuitous time because I started there, and the artists and the creators who were coming through, everyone from John Byrne to Walt Simonson and Bill Sienkiewicz and John Romita Jr. and all that, but even the people that worked on staff in the bullpen, and we really did have a bullpen that the editorial offices surrounded the bullpen. But my first day, I was sitting at my desk and a gentleman by the name of Danny Crespi showed up. He ran the bullpen, production manager. And Danny, like for for your readers who are my age or older, or not readers, your viewers, um, Danny was a letterer from, who was lettering comic books in the 1960s. And so, classic, you know, logos and the sound effects and all that. Those were things that were being done by Danny. And in the bullpen was Jack Abel, who was our proofreader when I came in. And but Jack Abel was an anchor over Jack Kirby back in the day, and another gentleman, Maury Kuramoto, who worked in the bullpen. I mean, these guys all worked at the very beginning of Marvel, and I got to learn from them. So that's why I consider myself very lucky to have kind of stumbled in to it when and then I was dropped off after I met all of them and they showed me how to make comics. Then the next person I got to meet was John Romita, not Junior.
okay,
John
yeah.
Romita, the original. And that kind of took the wind out of my sails because while I was not, I would never classify myself as a hardcore comic book fan.
Mhm.
I was a comic book reader, and I have these memories of when I was very young and during the winter. Sorry about that.
Ah,
My my just if it was cold and we would sit around a friend's um, dining room table, and we had stacks of Spider-Man comic books where we were all trying to draw Spider-Man. And I realized when I met John Romita, it was his Spider-Man I was trying to draw, you know, and it was just so it was a very I felt very fortunate to be involved at that particular moment. And then, and then there were my immediate um associates, my peers, Mark Gruenwald, and you name it. It was just it was a very fun time.
I
Um,
know it's wonderful. Again, it's wonderful to hear, and it's great because sometimes at the moment I'm just cutting together. Last year we did a mini series on Steve Ditko, and we got some great interviews with family and colleagues, and we're recutting it for the summer as a documentary. And like he
mhm.
had a very interesting dynamic and didn't seem to enjoy his Marvel experience as much, but very much enjoyed the work. And it's great to hear as well such a positive, connection that you have because I feel today every time you turn on your phone and read the news, there's more negative or you enjoy something and the production behind it was a nightmare. But this sounds like it's more, yeah, it's not all doom and gloom all the time. Sometimes it's like people
Oh,
get on.
I mean, there were aspects of it that were a job,
Mhm,
but for
mhm.
the most part, I would come home at the end of the day and say, I can't believe I'm getting paid to do this. And it just my Steve Ditko story is that I had a standing order from Tom DeFalco when he was editor in chief, and I was editor under him, which was if Steve ever shows up and is looking for work, you find it for him. No questions asked. You just, I mean, he was foundational to what we were all doing, and he should never have to ask more than once. If even if he didn't ask, if he just made it be known that he was available, you find something for him to do. And I did. And I remember, and I worked with Steve on a few occasions,
Great.
and I've always found him very pleasant. He was very serious about his work, and he would. I remember the first time he brought pages in, and then he would put them down on my desk, standing next to me, and then would narrate the story that he had just drawn, so I couldn't see what was going on. But he would basically tell me, well, this is what's happening here and there and here. And in my I never heard most of what he said. And I will clean up my language what was going through my head because all I could think of is, oh my God, this is Steve Ditko. Oh my God, this is Steve Ditko. Oh my God, this is Steve Ditko. Steve Ditko was basically telling me a bedtime story, but early. I mean, quite frankly, it would have worked perfectly now when you can go and go on any app and get those nighttime stories. It was kind of like that for me because I was totally in the zone because I'm getting to work with Steve Ditko, which just it made the 20, we'll say I was 28, 29-year-old me turn into an 11-year-old me. Who was reading those comics at the time. I was and am still a huge Ditko fan. More so his Doctor Strange than his
Yeah.
Spider-Man. I felt like I could just fall into those Doctor Strange comics that he did.
There's a great book that on the podcast we had Dr. Zach Cruzy, and he did a book, Mysterious Travelers, looking at
Mhm,
Steve Ditko's work and his kind of philosophy towards his work.
mhm,
And Doctor Strange, it's really interesting because in the early story, he didn't begin with the origin. It looked like he was being depicted as Asian. So Dr. Cruzy wrote to him and more or less got the confirmation that yes, that was the original intent. But when the origin came along, that's where the Stephen Strange came in and much
right.
more anglicized and
Uh-huh.
the Doctor. But yeah, it's just interesting. He had a whole that whole Doctor Strange, that really was because I know he had a background in horror comics beforehand, but
Uh-huh.
that was like a fountain of different what could be done in comics.
Exactly.
Amazing. Yeah.
Exactly. And I think it also lent itself very much to his style.
Yeah.
And in a way, I mean, of course, I loved his Spider-Man because
Yeah.
Spider-Man was Spider-Man. Uh, but there's something just very special that I think the first Doctor Strange stuff that I've read by Ditko was not even a full-size comic. It was they used to do those little digest-sized
Yeah.
comics, and I discovered one of those, and I went, wow. And who knows? Maybe I was slightly older and was considering experimenting with formatting. I don't know.
Expand your
Um,
horizons.
yes,
But
exactly.
I don't,
Um,
with creators and association with characters as well, because you mentioned earlier on about Ghostwriter as well. Like you've kind of had one of those like golden moments in comics where an opportunity presents itself with a character, and then it's very much like yourself and Ghostwriter now, go together like ham and cheese, as or it's like, yeah. How did was that always like? Did you always have it in your mind to work on a particular, like, do when you finally got into the role of writing? Did you then go, I want to go steady with a particular character, like get a body of run behind it? Or did all that just, again, just kind of presented itself?
yeah. As I said, I was learning on the job.
Mhm.
And so, I had that first Iron Man job, and I did 2 issues of Chuck Norris and his Karate Commandos, which
Amazing.
classic. It was strictly because they needed a writer, and I practiced martial arts at the
Oh, very good.
time, and said, "Oh, Howard, you know karate? Here, you should do this." Okay. I had seen all of Chuck Norris's movies, so why the heck not? Um, so I did that, and then it was a whole series of sometimes fill-ins, one-shots. I did an issue of Power Pack, which was really fun. And then I had gotten working for Mark Gruenwald, the what was originally called Solo Avengers, and then transitioned into Avengers Spotlight, which was 2 11-page stories. The lead feature was always Hawkeye,
Mhm.
and Tom DeFalco had started writing it. Then he left, so Mark wanted me to take over. And it was really Mark teaching me how to write comics, because essentially what we'd do, I'd go into Mark's office or we'd go out to lunch and he'd say, okay, I'd like you to do a Hawkeye story with this character. Half the time I had never heard of the character because I was not, as much into Marvel lore as Mark was. They were usually old, usually kind of lame characters, and Texas Twister and Shooting Star, and the Orb, who was a classic Ghost Rider villain. And but prior to that, so that was really where I learned to write on a monthly basis, 11-page stories. And but when I was Mark's assistant, and one of the books that we worked on was the official handbook of the Marvel Universe, which is, every character in the Marvel Universe. And it was very editorially labor intensive. So I did not get paid overtime, but I was frequently working on at the office until midnight.
Oh, well.
And but with Mark, if my desk was here, Mark's desk was, you know, a foot away from me. That because it was a small room, and you have a lot of time to talk about things you like, you don't like, and in those conversations, talking about, I really liked Ghost Rider. I loved Johnny Blaze and Ghost Rider. I read the end of that series that it was ended with Mark DeMatteis, or DeMatteis, I believe he says his name now. He didn't always. And um, he was doing, and Bob Budiansky was the artist on it, and I read it, and then it got canceled. And so now I was a full editor. I had some regular writing work experience behind me, And Mark, who is now the executive editor, he was one step down from editor in chief. He showed up in my office at one point and he said, Howard, I know you're a big fan of Ghost Rider. I said, yes. He said, we're thinking of bringing the character back in a regular series. Why don't you give us a pitch? And I said, great. Yeah, fantastic. This is my idea of heaven. And he started leaving my office and he stopped in the doorway. He said, oh, yeah, one caveat. You can't use Johnny Blaze. And I
Oh,
said, what? I wanted to use Johnny Blaze because it's just a really cool name, quite frankly. And he said, nope, we want a new character, no baggage, younger, come up with somebody new. And that's how I created Danny Ketch. And he, what I didn't know, which would have frightened me to the point of not doing anything, was I thought they were just asking me to do a pitch. Well,
hmm.
it turned out they had about 7 or 10 pitches they had solicited from others, all of whom were far more experienced writers than I was at the time, because I saw the stack and I recognized like there certain people that would only they didn't use computers or typewriters and would only do it handwritten, and I would have said, oh no, I'm not going to compete against these guys, but mine was the one that they chose, Mark and Tom DeFalco, and it was a hard sale, as it were, because um, they the sales department, marketing, said no, we can't sell this book because unknown writer with two unknown artists, Javier Saltaras and Mark Texera, who were at the very beginning of their careers, working on a failed character, which Ghost Rider was. It was canceled because of low sales. They said, we can't sell this. And we got jerked around for a long time about that. Like we were changing formats. We were doing also the I found out many years later that the head of the sales department had written a long memo to the publisher and the president of the company saying why we should not publish this book,
Good Lord.
for all those things. I mean, she really was invested in not having this see the light of day. And it was only because Tom DeFalco eventually just exerted some editor in chief uh, um, power that he just said, nope, we're doing it as a regular comic. And then of course the first issue launch, as a matter of fact, even before that, I remember I was standing in Bobby Chase's office. Bobby Chase was the editor, and she was showing me the cover to the first issue. And suddenly I heard somebody behind me, and I will not mention the name, um, but a very famous comic book writer say, "Oh, they're bringing that back," in a very derogatory way. And I was very pleased that issue number one outsold his comic. But um, they, the sales were quite good. And
Excellent.
to her credit, the woman who was the head of sales showed up to Tom DeFalco's office with a copy of the memo in her hand that she had written to, and tore it into pieces and threw it into the trash and said, I was wrong. So, and that, yes. And then, so that's how I got Ghost Rider. And then that pretty much launched the rest of my career.
That's
Um,
incredible. And really, like all the credit to Mark as well as an editor, he really understood how, like he's striking me from the stories you're telling here that he understood how to get the best out of you without putting the pressure onto you in such a way. Like there's other editors could have played people against each other, could have been like, this has to get like pushed down, but he knew you had in knew that you had it in you to do the best with this and kind of
Mhm.
notched you along the way. And then Tom DeFalco to come in
Yep.
and push it. That's
Yeah.
it's very good, a good editor that uplifts and provides a
I just
platform.
had that conversation with Tom DeFalco 2 weekends ago at Heroes Con. We were sitting next to each other, and it was early on in my career working with a variety of editors. I learned very valuable lessons on how I wanted to act as an editor. And I was very fortunate with some of the editors. I had one editor very early in my career where I almost quit writing entirely,
Okay.
even though he accepted what I had turned into him, but made me feel so bad about it that I
Okay.
thought, oh, well, who am I fooling? And then right after that meeting, I went to another editor who I had submitted to, and the other editor tore it to shreds right in front of me, like just took it apart, like all the things that didn't work, and then proceeded to show me how to put it back together. And I left that office knowing that he had confidence in me to be able to do it and to write. And I really, this was an editor by the name of, only mention the good editors' names, Sid Jacobson, who was a longtime comic book editor. He worked for Harvey Comics
Okay, cool.
in the day, and then he did Marvel's when Marvel did the Star line of comics, which was, a more a younger audience line of comics. So Sid had a lot of experience, and he informed me that's the kind of editor I want to be, is to work with people and to teach them when I can, and to not it doesn't have to be an adversarial relationship, and too often, unfortunately, it is.
Mm.
uh, but I was very fortunate with, I would say, 90% of the editors, or maybe even a higher number, the editors that I've worked with in my career have been spectacular. I mean, it's why I'm still friends with so many of them.
Awesome.
And I will say, to my credit as well, because of taking that approach in the other direction, I am still friends with most of the creators that I worked with, the artists and writers. So it was a very valuable lesson that I learned early on, and it started with Mark and continued with others.
So that's amazing. No, it's great to hear, and it's great to hear like this is a collaborative medium as well. Like so often people forget, they either think it just appears on the shelf on the tablet, and then they think it might be just whoever's name's biggest in font on the cover, and then it really is. It's a whole team behind it that helps bring out the best, and everyone has their fair contribution. So, it's great to hear onto it. Just to push ahead just a bit to like later, but with the other companies as well, with DC, you of course did back in I think the original Batman Black and White run. You had a short story. Am I correct in that with the
Yeah, I don't
Intruders?
know that it was the original, but it was
Okay.
a few a few incarnations in. I did a short story with worked with, the editor was Mark Chiarello.
Yeah,
Uh,
and Chris Samney was the artist, I think, onto it
yes,
as well. So yeah,
yes.
yeah.
And that was before Chris was Chris Samney. Yes. I was very fortunate with many of the, I've worked with both, long established um, artists who have taught me so much, but then I also got to work with newer artists at the beginning of their career, both as a writer and editor. I mean, as an editor, I worked with Lee Weeks very early on his career, and Steve Epting, um, and others, and then of course Chris. But that was a funny experience. I knew Mark Chiarella really well. He worked at Marvel first, and then he was over at DC. And he called me out of the blue and said, "Howard, did you ever think about writing a Batman story. And I thought, oh, that'd be awesome. Like Batman is one of the first characters I remember reading as a child. And so I said, oh, yeah, that's great. Now, this was at a stage in my career where I had written Spider-Man for 10 years, in various incarnations. I had had a 7-year run or 6-year run on Ghost Rider. I was what would be, I think, safely is a seasoned pro. Okay. And then I sat down at the blank screen and I went, "Oh my God, Batman!" I was I was completely and totally intimidated by writing a Batman story, because it was Batman. And but I did, and it was a fantastic experience. It was actually the best experience I had working at DC. There were not a lot of good ones, but I mean, Mark Chiarello was a phenomenal editor. Yeah, I mean, he's just a great guy. But yeah, yeah. So that was fun.
Oh, when finally breaking the story, was it trying to come because you chose the ventriloquist like Scarface into it? So was that I think it was called Headspace. Was that the to break the story? Did you have to figure out who the rogue was going to be to come to the story, or did you have the story in mind when
Oh no,
tackling
I
Batman?
was just I was it was suddenly they threw me in a boat and said, "Yeah, head out there." And yeah, well, maybe we'll give you a sail or one oar. Um, no, that was straight. I mean, sometimes my process, and this
Mhm,
was something I learned from Tom DeFalco, is writing is writing, and writing
mhm,
begets writing. So when sometimes I don't know, especially when I was doing at the peak of my career, I was writing quite a few monthly comic books,
mhm.
sometimes 4 or 5 a month, or maybe four monthlies, and then a special here and there, graphic novel, whatever. And people say, "How do you do it? Where do you get your ideas?" You get your ideas because you have to. I think John Byrne has always said to me, writer's block is for amateurs. What I knew, I had a young family and I had food to put on the table and a roof to put over our head. So what it meant was showing up, and sitting down at the computer, my workspace, and sometimes I just start writing. And now if I was doing a monthly comic, it was a little easier because you're in the mindset of the character, Ghost Rider or Spider-Man or Peter Parker or Danny Ketch, whatever. And sometimes what you do, and this is what I learned from Tom, is you just start writing. And for me, it could be something as simple as we open this story with Spider-Man running across a rooftop and shooting out a web and hits the side of the building. He goes swinging down the block, and then I just keep rolling with
Mhm.
that until he turns a corner and he finds the story for me. And then I say, "Oh, okay, this is where we're going to stop." And all of that stuff that I wrote, and sometimes it can be as much as 5 pages, and that goes into a separate file. And because now I found the story, and that's where the I think it's not that, I mean, not that that first part is not creative, because you have to have that mindset to a certain extent, but now it's the drilling down and looking into it, especially on a monthly series. Okay, now that thing that I just found, how does that fit with everything else that is going on in my Spider-Man book or the 4 other Spider-Man books that were being published by Marvel at the same time? So,
And be
and again, that's a process
yeah.
thing. It's just, but I couldn't, if I if I only wrote when I was inspired, um, I would have starved long ago. You find your inspiration as far as I'm concerned, because, and this was even as an editor, it was the thing that I sometimes had to have conversations with artists about. Is It's a monthly medium, so you means, or it was a monthly medium. I think that's become a little less so over the years. But we produced monthly comics when I was at starting out at Marvel and then through my writing career. And you don't have the luxury of writer's block is a luxury that you can't afford. And if that meant describing that process, if that meant I was up until 2 or 3 in the morning looking for that story, I stayed up until 2 or 3 in the morning looking for that story. I'm also an obsessive, to this day, notebook person. So, random ideas come in, they go into my notebook and they sit there sometimes, and sometimes they turn into fertilizer, and sometimes you know, they grow flowers. Oh God, I love speaking in metaphor. It makes me sound like a writer. Uh, and it just, but you just have to, I find for the longest time, my daughters didn't understand. We have a dishwasher in our kitchen, which for the longest time we never used because I liked washing dishes because there was something almost meditative for me. It was the running water, it was the mindless action, and then my brain just kicked in. Driving, I find, and my wife learned early on in our career. Again, I was just talking, Tom DeFalco and I were just talking about this. We'd be on a long stretch of highway. I'm staring out the window, and she had either a question or comment or something that she would always start with, are you driving right now or are you working? Because she knew that when I was that, because I'm almost never quiet. And if I'm quiet for a long time, that usually means I'm thinking of a story.
The notebook is a great approach though as well, because I often say to the students, like, anything that you have, just write it down, because the worst ink will outlast the best memory is what we say. So like, just get
Yeah.
it down, keep it, and you might discover it later, use it. But so often people have great ideas, but then they forget it, because they don't
How
write it
many
down.
great ideas do you have right before you slip off to sleep, or in
Mm,
the middle of the night you have a dream and you say, "Oh, I'm going to remember that in the morning." I keep a notebook, or these have
yeah,
become very good for that. Just
yeah.
I will quick send myself an email or open the notes app and just jot down whatever I'm thinking, just so that I have an anchor point, because memory is an elusive thing. And I personally have never had that. I have friends that have, you know, ironclad memory. John Byrne is he's like on the spectrum, because he can remember everything. And I know I have so many things bouncing around at the same time, both in my my creative world, but also my personal life. That gotta right. I have a notebook, everywhere, but this is such a time saver, uh, but you really can't beat, the feel of a pen or a pencil on a piece of paper, as far as I'm
Yeah.
concerned.
Yep.
Um,
The tactile nature of it, absolutely, absolutely. And this summer we're heading into now. There's a new Spider-Man film coming out, so and Amazing Spider-Man's about to come to about 1,000. So Marvel and Disney very much Spider-Man orientated, and just given your association with the character of such a period, how like have you stayed in touch with Spider-Man anyway? Like, have you been dipping into the comics or into the films, or how has that been? As he more of a distant relative now to you?
I have this policy, as it were, that once I'm done writing a character, I don't read anything
Hmm.
afterwards. And it's primarily because I do a lot of this type of thing, both podcasts and print interviews and all that. And I don't ever want to accidentally say something that could be viewed as a criticism of
Hmm.
something that somebody has done after me. And because not my character, not
Hmm.
my, so I just choose not to do it. I've made a few rare exceptions. I
Hmm.
also don't ever reread any of my own stuff,
Hmm.
because if when I do, for the most part, what I see are my mistakes or the changes the editor has made. And so what once it's published, that is. So I wind up either getting depressed or angry. So I avoid that. The movies, on the other hand, I have pretty much loved the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And I mean, the Spider-Man movies up until recently were separate, but I
Hmm.
think Tom Holland as a phenomenal Peter Parker. I'm looking forward to the new movie. I have not seen the Spider-Man Noir
Oh, it's
TV
fun. It's
show.
fun.
Yeah, well, that Terry Kavanagh was just talking to me and trying. I I dropped Amazon for
Fair enough. Fair
but
enough.
I may have to dip back in so I can see it. Just you know, the kind of feeling that I feel like we're living in a time with the rise of the supervillains that I once tried to create, and they're becoming a reality.
True,
Um,
true.
but I've loved and I see all of and of course there have been some hits and misses,
Mhm.
but for the most part, I feel like the movies and the cinematic universe has been true to the essence
Mhm.
of what the characters were and should
Yeah.
be. So I don't get too caught up in, oh well, it didn't happen exactly like that in the stop. These comic books have existed for 50 more than 50 years, and uh you can't make everything work. But I genuinely enjoy it, but sometimes it's wistful for me because, again, going back to my friend and mentor Mark Gruenwald, he would have loved all of this, and he never got to see
Mhm.
any of it, including the fact that a lot of the storylines, especially in the Avengers, anything involving Captain America, they came from Mark's stories when he was writing Cap. So it is bittersweet for me to see some of it, but I do like that. I am um, an older gentleman, and I'm able to get transported back to, you know, feeling like I'm an 11-year-old sitting in the seats of the theaters when I see a lot of these movies. Oh.
Absolutely. And it's a great policy as well that you had there as well. The whole, it's almost like, as they say, you can never go home again when you do your piece with a character. But and I really appreciate your approach to as well, not finding to be construed as a criticism, because it's very easy now with social media that everyone's an armchair critic, easier to tear down than be constructive.
Mhm.
Obviously, when you're in industry, the internet isn't what it is today. So, like in terms of
No, no, no. The internet wasn't.
yeah, I suppose it's like it's just wasn't in the equation.
Mhm.
But I suppose fan letters, conventions, and stuff like you could receive, negative feedback, but not to the same volume. But just for anyone who might be listening, who might be a nascent creator or somebody, is to have it been an experience where you kind of, you know receive feedback on a project, and maybe it was like from outside of your colleagues, but it's from like the readership, and then how do you process that? Like how do you let that, take something on board or listen to it, but at the same time not let it steer you off the path that you're going on? Is there anything there that a mentor or your own philosophy you came across to help you in those moments? That anything there?
Yeah, I remember many years ago, and at the beginning of the internet, uh, um, when it was a series of tubes running under our houses. Um, I remember a fellow writer said to me, Howard, how do you deal with this? Because there is no shortage of criticism about me. Whenever I introduce myself to somebody and they'll say like their brother or their cousin or, oh, he's a big comic book fan. And I said, well, they may know who I am, and just be prepared. They may love me or really hate me. There doesn't seem to be a middle ground there. And I have been, I anyway, this fellow writer said, "How do you deal with this? All the negative stuff that is written about you on online?" And I said, "Very easily. I don't read it." And that is because I know my personality, and I know that I think I am not unique to this, but I can read 99 positive things about my work and then one negative thing, and the only thing I'll remember is the negative thing. And it will just drag me down. And I can't, when I'm creating, I can't afford to be in that headspace. I was very fortunate. At the beginning of social media, Facebook, when I signed up for Facebook, really, I signed up just to irritate my daughter, who was in college at the time, and um, she we were having dinner with friends, and the gentleman said he was so proud he was on Facebook and he had 4 friends. And my daughter said to him, "I think it's just creepy that anybody over the age of whatever 25 has a Facebook page." And I said, "Really?" And when they were our neighbors who lived directly next door, I said, "Really?" And so I got up, I walked next door, I grabbed my laptop, I came over and said, "Now, what is this thing called again?" And I signed up for Facebook and immediately was reconnected with, probably 100 people that I had known forever and had started to lose track of, like colleagues and friends and people I went to grammar school with, and all that. And so I liked it. But in all that time, very early on, I had one person who sought me out to tell me how lame I was and how what a horrible writer I was. And I just said, "Well, thank you so much." And and then just got rid of them. I do not debate. I do not argue on social media, as a rule. But I've been very fortunate at conventions. Anybody that comes to see me at a convention is usually a fan. And and I've had some amazing experiences where I've had people who were like big biker dudes. Like I am not a small individual. I'm 6'1" and 200 pounds, and these guys make me look, tiny, and will come up to me to the point where my wife, if she's there, will go, a little scary looking, and start telling me about the impact that some of my stories have had on them because they grew up in like a harsh environment or abusive family or something like that. And I remember one gentleman in particular, he's starting to tell me the story, and again, looked like he just stepped off his motorcycle and he started to choke up. And I said, "No, no, no, don't, you can't cry." I said, "Because I'm an old man now. I see a sentimental TV commercial and you start crying and I'm going to cry right back." But I mean, I love that. I do remember um, years ago, my friend Fabian Nicieza, who
Mhm.
wrote X-Men forever, and always when he was at New York Comic Con, he had a long line of people waiting for him. So it took some time. The line, sometimes you're waiting in line for a half an hour. Somebody came to his table and said, got right into his face. It said, "You were the worst X-Men writer to ever did. And I just hate your stuff." And Fabian said, "Well, I'm so pleased you waited a half an hour to tell me that, but you have a nice day." He said, "But I
Yeah,
admire commitment."
that's
So I know that there are detractors out there, and social media does give rise to some very brave individuals who do not have to, face one,
Yeah.
well, face to face, but that's okay. That's okay. I mean, it's when I look at the number of published comics that are out there with my name on them, of course there are going to be people that don't like every single thing I've written, and that's okay. And then hopefully they found something else that did suit them better. But that's like I said, that's okay. I couldn't. I In the old days, it took more commitment to criticize because you had
Mhm.
to, you know, handwrite a letter, then fold it up, find an envelope, find a stamp. You had to look in the front of the comic book for the address, then you had to post it. And you know what? That I admire that commitment to both, to criticize or to to praise. And but that's how it was done in those days. Now it's like anything that pops into their head, they can just go online and and be done.
Yeah, it's like some ways the technology can either bring us together, push us apart, or bring out our worst demons, you know. But for,
I think now it's more divisive than it is unifying.
Yeah, but hopefully these things, swings and roundabouts, hopefully, cyclical, will push through to the other end. And, ultimately stories are what bind us. So hopefully, it bring us together more positively.
Yeah.
And for folks listening, Howard, if they want to follow your latest projects or keep in contact with you or anything, do you have a particular channel that you direct people to or anything?
I really should have a web page. Maybe I'll get around to doing that, but it's too much work.
True.
I'm a freelancer. I became a freelancer, so I didn't have to work so hard. Says the man who was writing 5 monthly titles at one point until 3 o'clock in the morning. But mostly the only social media I am on with any sort of regular basis is Facebook,
Mhm.
and it's Howard Mackie Writer. I think I have another one floating around there
Mhm.
that I don't look at ever. So,
Gotcha.
but Howard Mackie Writer, and the only thing I do is post about my latest work or convention appearances or that sort of thing. So that's the best way to stay up to date with me. I'm working for a company called 24/7 Comics, 247comics.com. I would, especially if you're a fan of my ghostwriter work, I'm doing a number of projects with them right now. One in particular, um, I'm working with an artist by the name of Mark Texera, which has more than a little of the ghostwriter flavor to it. It will
Awesome.
be announced in a couple of weeks at San Diego Comic-Con, which I will be attending. If anybody
Awesome.
is going to be in San Diego, please come and see me. But 247 comics.com, they have a newsletter and the editor in chief that I'm working with is Terry Kavanaugh. So
Yeah.
and we're Terry is really good at pulling in some established comic book creators and pairing them up with sometimes newer people in the industry.
That's awesome.
I'm having a blast. It's the most fun. This particular project with Mark is some of the most fun I've had working in comics in many years. I would say by far and away some of the best work Mark has done, and it just
Awesome.
really it feels like a comic book, which I like. No.
That's great. So look for the announcements coming out in San Diego in a couple of
Yep.
weeks and 247comics.com 247.
Yes.
That's awesome. This has been great, Howard. Thank you so much. Really appreciate this opportunity to speak with you. Hopefully, we were saying before the recording, you have some Irish roots. So hopefully in the future, we'll be able to meet face and face and, track down the bloodline for you.
Yes, from your lips.
This is wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a good one, Owen.